should be noted that this is the first environmental lecture to take place in this amazing new room. And one assumes that there will be hundreds and probably thousands over the years to come, and that they will be, on all the topics that are at the absolute forefront of this most important of issues, but probably very few will be any more important than the one that we hear this afternoon. Second thing, signal occasion. If I could have the 10 fellows of the stand up from our Middlebury Fellowships in Environmental Journalism, so everybody can see who you are, that would be terrific. This is the first week of the first year of this new fellowship in environmental journalism. These are 10 of the best young career, early career environmental journalists in the, I was going to say in the country, but really in the world, since we also have two of them, one from South Africa and one from Zimbabwe here, from all around the world. It's truly been an amazing week for us and a great opportunity, a great pleasure to get to see just what exciting things people are thinking about and doing at the start of their careers as environmental journalists. And to be able to do it up at Breadloaf and down here on campus is a great pleasure. As you know, this college is at the absolute forefront of things environmental at the moment. In fact, just this week won an enormously important and prestigious award as the most sustainable college in the country, something for which we should all be proud. But to see the people who are going to be sort of spreading the word in the years to come about what needs to be done and what can be done on this planet is enormously inspiring. I think especially for me and for Ross, who are old warhorses at this business. And with that, I really do want to just turn to Ross Gelbspan. Instead of giving you the sort of long introduction about all the different places he's worked and things that he's done over his career, suffice it to say that he is an extraordinarily able journalist and newspaperman with a long background, including leading a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigation at the Boston Globe and elsewhere. What I really want to talk about just for a minute is his significance and role in the environmental movement and fight in the last 15 years. Some of you will remember, who are of an age, will remember the first kind of burst of interest in global warming in the late 1980s. And in fact, that's when I wrote The End of Nature. It's when this issue was first on the lips of people. The science that we had then is essentially the science that we have today. And I think a lot of us assumed that probably action would follow quickly on the heels of revelation of the fact that the world faced this greatest danger that we've ever had. But action didn't follow, at least in this country. And as the 1990s dragged on, one of the really fascinating questions was why action wasn't following. Why was it that the opponents of this kind of work were able still to find such traction and such power? And that issue was answered in many ways powerfully by Ross's book on climate, The Heat Is On, published in 1997. It not only restated the case about what was happening on the Earth, but it did a marvelous job of providing the investigative underpinnings to understand why so little was happening in Congress. It demonstrated the endless and powerful links between the small network of climate skeptic scientists and the major fossil fuel industry players that in many ways were pulling their strings and shaping to an unbelievable extent the debate around climate. That book was played a very pivotal role in beginning finally the defeat of the climate deniers and of that fossil fuel lobbying effort, an effort that really is on its, well, not its last legs quite, but has certainly been weakened in the years since Ross did that work, and his follow-up book, Boiling Point, also an enormously important volume. I think that there's really no one in this country who's done a more important job of helping us to understand the political place that climate occupies. And I think also there are very few people in the world who have gone on the way that Ross has to offer a powerful set of possible solutions, to spend an enormous amount of time and effort traveling this country and this earth, making that case to powerful people everywhere that he can find them. He's at the absolute forefront of the movement to do something about global warming in this country. It's an enormous pleasure. It's been an enormous pleasure to have him all week working with the fellows, and it's an enormous pleasure to be able to introduce a very old and very tried and true friend here today, Ross Gelbspan. So thank you very much. All right, brother.
Thank you, my man. I have been here to Middlebury before, and unfortunately, despite what Bill said, I think Middlebury has changed much more, given these incredibly beautiful digs, than the political battle over global warming. And we'll go back over that in a minute. But I'm very, very moved by Bill's introduction. And before I start my talk, I would sort of like to just render my thanks to one of my great personal heroes, who is Bill. The End of Nature was far more than a significant book. It was a singular and extraordinary act of foresight and even more of courage. Before there was an IPCC, there was Bill McKibben. Before there was the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, there was Bill McKibben. Before there was Al Gore's book, Earth in the Balance, there was Bill McKibben. All of us who have written on this issue, Al Gore, Ross Gelbspan, Elizabeth Colbert, George Monbiot, all of us are standing on the deceptively broad shoulders of Bill McKibben. So what was an excessively complimentary introduction for you is a really gratifying treasure for me. That said, I think we should maybe all go home, because it can only go downhill from here. But I really do appreciate very much being invited to inaugurate this auditorium. It's magnificent. So thank you all so much for coming and for your attention. This climate crisis, as Bill said, has been visited on all of us by huge coal and oil companies that have blocked meaningful action on the climate in the U.S. for at least 15 years. Most regrettably, they have a powerful accomplice in a negligent and largely indifferent U.S. press. And because Chris told me that Middlebury is really interested in developing more interest in journalism, this talk is essentially going to really be talking about the subject through the lens of journalism, essentially. Nature is telling us to cut our use of coal and oil by 80%, and the rest of the world is listening. Holland, Britain, Germany, and France are already beginning to cut their emissions by 50 to 80% in the next 45 years. In the U.S., however, big coal and big oil still have a stranglehold on Washington. So if meaningful change is going to happen, we have to push it upward from the grassroots into the national consciousness. That puts a very difficult and a very unfair burden on all of you, but it also puts people working at the grassroots level in a particularly strategic position. For one thing, most of you will not have operatives of the carbon lobby putting their fingers in your eyes. While the coal and oil lobbies have paralyzed action at the federal level, they just don't have enough foot soldiers to stifle action in localities around the country. Those of you who are students are particularly well positioned. Our schools are seedbeds for social change. We look to our colleges and universities for new ideas and new directions. So if you can raise awareness of the climate crisis at your school, that message will reverberate throughout the larger community. Locally, it's also easier to get access to small news outlets. So when you talk to reporters, you can explain that when you cut your use of carbon fuels, you are not only cleaning up your own neighborhood, you are also helping people around the world whose crops are being destroyed by weather extremes, whose homelands are going under from rising sea levels, and whose borders will be overrun by environmental refugees. Ultimately, the most effective way to get that message out loudly and clearly is through an attentive and vigorous national news media. Unfortunately, the press is today in what I call stage 2 denial. They've finally come to acknowledge the reality of climate change, but they don't come close to reflecting the urgency and magnitude of the changes overtaking us. I'm not going to go through all the climate impacts and scientific findings that are surfacing almost on a weekly basis in the literature, but I would like to offer a couple of large-gauge observations about global climate change. The first is its speed. We have all been absolutely blindsided by global warming. Global warming didn't even surface in the public arena until 1988. That's the year that the UN decided to form an intergovernmental panel on climate change. It's the same year Jim Hansen went before Congress to declare that global warming is at hand. Today, a mere 19 years later, scientists are telling us that we are either approaching or already at a point of no return in terms of staving off climate chaos. That is an incredibly short period of time, historically speaking, in the blink of an eye, for such enormous changes in these massive planetary systems. As Harvard's Dr. Paul Epstein said to me recently, we are seeing impacts today that we did not expect until 2085. The second point, which presents one of the most difficult aspects of communicating this challenge, has to do with lag times and feedbacks. Carbon dioxide stays up there for 100 years, so many of the impacts we're already seeing are probably the result of emissions we put up in the 70s and 80s, even before India and China began to ramp up their surge of coal-fired industrialization. This makes it virtually inevitable that we will see many more impacts of the magnitude of Katrina and the European heat wave of 2003. The issue is further compounded by the existence of feedbacks in which small changes in certain planetary systems trigger much larger changes in other systems. For example, the tundra in Siberia for thousands of years has trapped methane and carbon dioxide into its frozen terrain. Now that area is beginning to thaw and release those gases back into the atmosphere, and that could well trigger a new spike in heating. The final of these observations involves the extreme sensitivity of Earth's systems to just a tiny bit of warming, and this also has caught the scientific community by surprise. As we all know, the glaciers are melting, the deep oceans are heating, violent weather is increasing, the timing of the seasons is changing, and all over the world, birds, plants, insects, fish, animals, and whole ecosystems are migrating toward the poles in search of stable temperatures. And all that has resulted from 1 degree of warming. And by contrast, we are looking forward to a century of 4 to 10 degrees of warming. What we need is a rapid worldwide switch to non-carbon energy, to wind and solar and tidal and wave power and biofuels and ultimately hydrogen fuels, and we need it yesterday. That doesn't mean we all have to sit in the dark and ride bicycles. Those sources can give us all the energy we use today. The fossil fuel lobby knows that perhaps better than anyone else, and its response has been to protect the industry at the expense of the rest of us in general, and more specifically at the expense of the lifeblood of any democratic system, which is honest information. For more than a decade, the carbon lobby has mounted a very effective campaign of deception and disinformation, almost exclusively inside the U.S., to persuade the public and policymakers that this issue is stuck in uncertainty. That campaign for the longest time attacked the science, and in so doing, it marginalized the findings of more than 2,000 scientists from 100 countries reporting to the UN in what is the largest and most rigorously peer-reviewed scientific collaboration in history. That same campaign has also misrepresented the economics of an energy transition, and now with its champion in the White House, it's attempting to demolish the diplomatic foundations of the Climate Convention. From the perspective of an investigative reporter, the central drama underlying this issue is crystal clear. It basically pits the ability of this planet to support our civilization versus the survival of one of the largest commercial enterprises in history. The oil and coal industries together generate more than $1 trillion a year in revenues. In this battle, their resources are without limit. I want to give you a few recent examples. In the early 90s, the coal industry launched a disinformation campaign using a few greenhouse skeptics that Bill mentioned, 3 of whom got about $1 million under the table from the coal industry, which was never disclosed until we published it. That campaign featured a $250,000 video designed to persuade us that global warming was good for us. That was in the early 90s. Understand that these people are extremely persistent. We got a new memo last summer from a group of coal companies about the launch of yet another such campaign, producing a major movie to counter Al Gore's film, increasing support for Senator Inhofe, who has called global warming the greatest hoax ever perpetrated on the American people, and raising lots more money to buy lots more airtime for more skeptics. This manufactured denial is by far the biggest obstacle facing all of us at work on this issue. Launched a decade ago by the coal industry, it has been carried forward most recently by the oil industry, which has spent more than $20 million since 1998 to bankroll these skeptics and their institutions. ExxonMobil has been an especially active player in this game. In 2001, the head of the IPCC, Dr. Robert Watson, suggested that the U.S. might be doing a little less than it could to act on this issue. ExxonMobil then sent a memo to President Bush telling him to get rid of Watson, and in short order, Watson was out of a job. ExxonMobil also made it very clear that it strongly opposed any U.S. involvement with the Kyoto process, so when President Bush formally withdrew the U.S. from Kyoto, the White House sent several thank you notes to ExxonMobil, thanking the company for its active involvement in helping shape the administration's policies. The industry's fingerprints on the administration's climate and energy policies surfaced again 2 years ago. Early in his administration, President Bush appointed an attorney from the American Petroleum Institute to head up the White House Climate Office. When that appointee, Phil Cooney, was found to have personally altered a major scientific document by softening and deleting references to coming impacts in the U.S., he was forced to resign from the White House. 4 days later, he was hired by ExxonMobil. As recently as last summer, the company moved to further distort public policy. That February, 86 evangelical ministers urged strong action on global warming, both to help preserve God's creation and also to care for the most vulnerable among us, who are poor people in developing countries who suffer the most from climate impacts. That was followed 6 months later by a statement from a separate and previously unknown group of evangelicals who proclaimed that climate change is God's will, and it's not that bad anyway. And it turned out that this new group was a $3 million creation by ExxonMobil. And several months ago, Vice President Cheney declared, "We need a big debate to determine the real cause of climate change," as though it had not been settled by more than 2,000 scientists more than a decade ago. Parenthetically, we had some fun with one of the most visible of these skeptics a couple of years ago, Fred Singer. Singer declared in a letter to the Washington Post that he had not accepted any oil industry money for 20 years since he did some consulting gig for an oil company. Shortly thereafter, we published the fact that Singer had received about $75,000 from ExxonMobil in 1998. And lest you think this was an ingenious job of investigative reporting, it happened to be on ExxonMobil's website. Of course, they took down the page right after the article ran. But by dictating this administration's climate policies, the fossil fuel lobby has realized some of its most cherished fantasies, and this is a connection which seems to have eluded the mainstream press. 6 years ago, the president reneged on his campaign promise to cap emissions from power plants. The administration then announced the first draft of its energy plan. It called for up to 1,900 new power plants, most of them coal-fired, which is basically a fast track to climate hell. Recently, one of the country's most prominent scientists, NASA's Jim Hansen, learned he was being censored when the agency ordered him to get prior approval for any media interviews or lectures or papers he published. Shortly thereafter, it was learned that researchers at the government's main climate agency, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, could not take part in any press interviews without an agency minder being present. This is extremely ominous to a journalist. The reason I was able to write my 2 books as hard as I could was because of what scientists said to me off the record. On the record, scientists speak in very conservative language. They talk in terms of trends and estimates and probabilities. Off the record, they said to me, this stuff is scary as hell. And it gave me a context and a perspective for understanding what I was writing. And that is a perspective I never would have gotten if I had an agency minder sitting at my elbow. In short, the White House has become the East Coast branch office of ExxonMobil and Peabody Coal, and climate change has become the preeminent case study of the contamination of our political process by money. To me, as a journalist, this campaign goes way beyond the normal reach of public relations spin. To me, this basically amounts to an attempt to privatize truth. Do understand that climate change is no longer an issue of science or technology. This is a titanic clash of interests that continues to go on. Clearly, the most pernicious influence on of this campaign has been on press coverage in the U.S., because the mainstream press has done a really dismal job in covering climate change. The U.S. public is about 10 years behind the rest of the world in appreciating its magnitude and urgency. By framing global warming as merely an environmental problem, the press is effectively burying the fact that this is an issue of our collective survival. Many editors, for example, diminish this reality by casting climate change as a kind of proxy issue for political liberals. This is not the case. The earliest and most forceful advocate, as you know, was conservative Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, and that's because she had a chemistry background and she understood what we were doing to the atmosphere. William F. Buckley, who is the father of the conservative movement, has written, "This is not an Al Gore issue. We really are producing too many greenhouse gases for the planet to accommodate." Former CIA Director Jim Woolsey and Republican Senator Richard Lugar recently wrote a long piece in Foreign Policy about the need to deal with climate change. President Bush's first Treasury Secretary, Paul O'Neill, has likened the coming impacts of global warming to a nuclear holocaust. And the senator who took the lead in trying to begin to regulate carbon emissions is conservative Senator John McCain. So it would be nice if the press would report on the real rather than the assumed politics of global warming. I think there are other reasons why the climate crisis has gotten such short shrift in the press. On a somewhat superficial level, the career path to the top of news outlets normally lies in following the track of political reporting. Top editors tend to see all issues through a political lens. For example, while climate change has been the focus of a number of feature stories about dying trees in Alaska and small buried reports of scientific findings, the times it's gained real news prominence is when it's played a role in the country's politics. I think of the 1992 elections when the first President Bush slapped the label Ozone Man on Al Gore because of his book Earth in the Balance, and I don't think it's a coincidence that Gore totally ran away from the climate issue when he ran again in 2000. The issue again received prominent coverage in 1997 when the Senate voted not to ratify the Kyoto Protocol, not because of the substance, but because it was a setback for the Clinton White House by a rebellious Senate. More recently, the issue surfaced when President Bush withdrew the U.S. from Kyoto, and that coverage also focused not on the impacts and the reality of climate change, but on resulting diplomatic tensions between the U.S. and the EU. Prior to his withdrawal from Kyoto, President Bush declared he would not accept the findings of the IPCC because it represented foreign science, even though about half the members of the IPCC are U.S. scientists. Instead, Bush called for a report from the U.S. National Academy of Sciences to provide American science. What I found astounding was this. Even as the Washington Press Corps reported this story, not one reporter that I read had bothered to check the position of the NAS. And had they done so, they would have found that as early as 1992, 3 years before the IPCC determined that human beings are changing the climate, the NAS recommended strong measures to minimize the impacts of human-induced global warming. The culture of journalism is basically a political culture which is not particularly hospitable. In fact, I think it's institutionally arrogant to non-political areas of coverage. Moreover, by applying the same rules they use in political coverage to their climate reporting, journalists have profoundly skewed their coverage of global warming. For example, for the longest time, the press accorded the same weight to the skeptics as they did to mainstream scientists. This was done in the name of journalistic balance. In fact, it represented journalistic ignorance. The ethic of balance comes into play when that story involves opinion. Should we sanction gay marriage? Should abortion be legal? Should we have English immersion or bilingual education? When a story involves opinion, a journalist is ethically obligated to give the major competing points of view their most articulate presentation in mostly roughly equal space. But when it's a question of fact, it's up to a reporter to get off his or her butt and find out what the facts are. The issue of balance is not relevant when the story is about facts. And in this case, what we know about the climate comes from more than 2,000 scientists in the largest scientific consensus in history. As one co-chair of the IPCC told me, there is no debate among any statured scientists about the larger trends of what's happening to the climate. And that is something you would never guess from the press coverage of climate change. Granted, there have been a few credentialed scientists, although only Dick Lindzen comes to mind, who have published in the peer-reviewed literature and who minimize climate change as relatively inconsequential. And in that case, if a journalist wants his or her coverage to be balanced, the story should reflect the weight of opinion in the scientific community. And that means the mainstream scientists will get 95% of the story, and the dissenters will get a few paragraphs at the end. That is finally beginning to happen, although very belatedly. Let me touch on another aspect. One of the first impacts of an unstable climate is an increase in extreme weather events, longer droughts, more frequent heat waves, more severe storms, and the fact that we get much more of our rain and snow in these intense, severe downpours. These extreme events also constitute a much larger portion of news budgets than they did 20 years. So given the dramatic increase in extreme weather events, you would think that journalists covering these stories might include a line that says, scientists associate this pattern of violent weather with global warming. They don't. Several years ago, I asked an editor at a major news network why, given the increased coverage of these natural disasters, they don't make that connection. And he said to me, we did that once. And I said, once? And he said, yeah, I think it was a big extreme flood they had in Mozambique in the year 2000. And the editor explained that after a network report suggested a possible link to global warming, several automobile and gasoline industry representatives threatened to withdraw all their advertising from the network if they persisted in making that connection. Beyond the narrow area of weather extremes, I think there's a deeper betrayal of trust here by the media. By now, most reporters and editors have heard from environmentalists. They've heard enough to know that global warming could at least have potentially catastrophic consequences. Given that reality, I think it is profoundly irresponsible for an editor or reporter to pass along the story with counterposing quotes without doing enough digging to satisfy himself or herself as to the bottom line gravity of the situation. Their assessment certainly needn't be the same as mine, but simply to treat this story like any other without taking the time to reach an informed judgment about it is a violation of the trust of readers and viewers who assume a background of informed interpretation by their news providers. The impact of this media failure was reflected in a couple of polls done by Newsweek magazine in the 90s. Back in 1991, 35% of the people who were polled said they thought global warming was a very serious problem. 5 years later, in 1996, even though the science had become far more robust and the IPCC declared it had found the human influence on the climate, that 35% had shrunk to 22%. Obviously, that's changed in the last couple of years as nature has become increasingly insistent on making itself heard. But it's an indication of what's been happening with the press. To be fair, apart from the manufactured denial by big coal and big oil, there is a natural human tendency to deny this reality. When a person is confronted with a truly overwhelming problem and he or she does not see an intellectually credible solution, that leaves you with a feeling of impotence, which is a very uncomfortable feeling, and so the only natural response is to deny it. And that applies to reporters and editors as much as to readers. But while journalists are subject to the same personal emotional reactions as the rest of us, they are supposed to be able to pierce society's cultural blinders. And here again, we see failure. It's obvious to anyone who has grappled with global warming that this problem cannot be solved by an unfettered free market economy. Perhaps if we had another 50 years to deal with the issue, the normal play of market forces would facilitate a gradual transition to a clean energy economy. But we don't have another 50 years. the scope of the problem requires rapid and significant and urgent regulatory intervention. But journalists, like the rest of us, are living in an age of fundamentalism. And while it's easy to see the manifestations of, say, Islamic fundamentalism in other parts of the world, it's harder to see that we in the U.S. today are caught in the grip of a kind of free market fundamentalism. And this has generated a widespread and, in my view, unwarranted mistrust of government. It has condemned the concept of regulation as heresy, and it's turned the word tax into an obscenity. But like it or not, the truth is there is no way that free markets will provide a timely and meaningful solution to global warming. The way news providers frame this issue also makes a huge difference. When journalists adopt jargon like greenhouse gases or emissions reductions, they end up mystifying the subject. They abstract it, and they leave readers feeling that the information's over their head. I think there are much more effective ways to present the topic. For example, we know that when nature and history collide, nature always wins, and history must always mourn its losses, tally up its casualties, and pick itself up and get started again. When journalists write about climate change, they could cast it in terms of the economic losses we will see as climate impacts diminish purchasing power and decimate markets abroad in developing countries, or alternatively in terms of the millions of jobs and the surge of new wealth that would be created through a global transition to clean energy. They could be connecting it to international stability by linking climate impacts to migrations of refugees and border conflicts. They could be connecting it to crop failures and water scarcity, and ultimately to issues of national security. There was a recent projection for climate-driven conflict by a group of 4-star generals and admirals, and it's clear that the military planners are way out in front of the press in terms of appreciating the larger political implications of climate change. There are enough aspects to this story: science, extreme weather, technology developments, oil industry movements, terrorism and security, diplomatic tensions, economic ramifications. This story should be in the paper 3 times a week. And rather than being ghettoized as a subbeat of environmental reporters, the issue should be covered in the business pages, in technology coverage, in health coverage, in science news, and on front-page coverage of domestic and international politics. Let me suggest a different and I think more appropriate political lens. A clean environment is not just an object of wish fulfillment for tree huggers. A clean environment is a basic human right, and without it, all the other human rights for which we have fought so hard will end up as grotesque caricatures of our deepest aspirations. Reframing the climate crisis could also help us navigate this very disorienting time we are living through. All kinds of boundaries are getting blurred between the local and the global, between personal health and planetary die-offs, between realism and alarmism, between environmentalism and democracy. It's particularly confusing to sort out the local from the global. In fact, it may be a wrong-headed way to think. I'm really not sure. For example, some environmental group websites tell us that more than 100 million Americans don't have access to safe drinking water. Well, there are about 2 billion individuals globally who face daily water shortages, partly because of the prolonged droughts and accelerated evaporation rates that accompany a warming atmosphere. Recently, one of my daughters, whose work takes her frequently to Latin America, told me that in Bolivia, people are abandoning whole villages because the glaciers are disappearing and they no longer have fresh water to irrigate their crops, so they're moving into these cities that are becoming increasingly chaotic and unmanageable. So here's the real challenge for all of us. How do we, in the most immediate and compelling way possible, get the press to present this story in all its aspects? One way, I think, is to focus on solutions. Individually, we can reduce our carbon footprints by using mass transit, by carpooling, turning down our thermostats, and changing our light bulbs. The bad news is that while many environmental problems are susceptible of correction by lifestyle changes, global warming isn't one of them. That's not to say you shouldn't take personal action. It is to say that if you do, what's really important is that you tell 100 other people why you're doing it. And that way you can create the political base that will allow politicians to make the really large-scale changes that nature demands. It's sort of heartening to see that climate change is finally surfacing as an issue in the current debates among presidential candidates, but it's disheartening to see that none of the candidates is treating this issue for what it really is, the central reality around which every other political issue should be organized. I've been promoting this policy of this sort of bundle of three strategies that we think could jumpstart this global transition to clean energy that Bill referenced. We're certainly not dogmatic about the details. We do think they represent an example of the scope and scale of action that's required. And I want to just take a couple of minutes and talk to you about these solutions. They involve three elements: a change in energy subsidy policies in the industrial countries, the creation of a large fund to transfer clean energy to poor countries, and a binding regulatory mechanism within the Kyoto framework that requires every country to increase its fossil fuel efficiency by 5% a year. Let me just say a couple of words about each. The federal government has traditionally spent about $25 billion a year subsidizing coal and oil. Under the Bush administration last year, that figure was $37 billion. In the industrial world overall, it exceeds $250 billion. If all those subsidies were removed from fossil fuels and put behind renewables, the oil companies would follow the money and become aggressive developers of solar panels and windmills and fuel cells. And I think that subsidy shift would also bring out of the woodwork an army of energy engineers and entrepreneurs with successively more efficient generations of solar, film, and turbines and wave and tidal devices in an explosion of creativity that would rival the dot-com revolution of the 90s. The second element is the creation of a large fund. It's been estimated by think tanks of about $300 billion a year for a decade to jumpstart clean energy infrastructures in developing countries. You can get this from carbon taxes in the north. A British cabinet minister has proposed tax on international air travel. One mechanism was proposed by a Nobel Prize-winning economist, and it involves a small tax on international currency transactions, in which banks and corporations and countries trade dollars against euros, against yen, and so forth. Today, the commerce in these currency transactions exceeds $1.5 trillion every day. And were they to be taxed at the rate of a quarter of a penny on a dollar, for technical reasons, they would net out to about $300 billion a year for wind farms in India, fuel cell factories in southern Africa, hydrogen farms on the deserts of the Middle East. In other words, a small tax on global commerce to preserve the global environment. And finally, I want to talk about this progressive fossil fuel efficiency standard, because this is the mechanism that would make it all work. Under this plan, every country would start at their own baseline to increase their fossil fuel efficiency by 5% a year. That means they would produce the same amount next year with 5% less carbon fuel, or they would produce 5% more with the same amount of carbon fuel. And since no economy grows at 5% for very long, emissions reductions would outpace long-term economic growth. On the ground, I think it would happen much more quickly than that. For the first few years, countries would meet this 5% just through efficiencies, just by getting the waste out of their current energy systems. And when these efficiencies became too expensive to capture, they would meet the 5% by bringing in more and more renewable sources, all of which, or most of which, are 100% efficient according to this fossil fuel standard. And that would create the mass markets and economies of scale that would bring down their prices and make them economically competitive with coal and oil. I think a plan of this magnitude, regardless of the details, would create millions and millions of jobs, especially in developing countries. It would turn impoverished and dependent nations into trading partners. It would raise living standards abroad without compromising ours. It would undermine the economic desperation abroad that gives rise to so much anti-U.S. sentiment. And in a very short time, it would jump the renewable energy industry into being a central driving engine of growth of the global economy. A final observation here: I think an antidote to the generalized denial that provides such fertile ground for these industry campaigns lies in an understanding that a switch to renewable energy represents a pathway to a richer, more equitable, and more secure world. And again, that's something you would never know from press coverage. It's only when that global inequity is redressed that we as a world can begin to gather all of us, to replace our material and acquisitive gratifications with the deeper rewards of intellectual and aesthetic creativity, of playful competitions, and of the truly abiding connectedness that comes from civic engagement, social relationships, personal friendships, and a sustaining and pervasive attitude of appreciation for our human and natural world. Stepping back for a moment just to conclude to a wider angle vantage point, the economy is becoming truly globalized. The globalization of communication now makes it possible for anybody in the world to communicate with anybody else all over the world. To me, that is a breathtaking development. And since it is no respecter of national boundaries, the global climate makes us one. But while the world is changing around us, our way of thinking is not keeping pace. For example, I think we are still bogged down by a stale and outdated nationalism, which in fact we long ago outgrew. I think our identity today depends much more on our common biological roots than on our different geographical ones. And that implies the outlines of a world in which, on the most pedestrian level, we eat locally and regionally grown food, and we take our energy from decentralized sources that are best suited to their natural surroundings. In terms of social organization, it implies to me a world in which most governance decisions are made at the local grassroots level through some kind of a consensual democratic process, with a few specific areas of governance taking place at a global level through our representatives. It also implies a very different way of thinking about economics. Just for one quick example, the real economic issue involved in rewiring the world with clean energy is not cost. The real economic issue is whether the world has a large enough labor force to accomplish this task in time to meet nature's deadline. We are already seeing the accelerating extinction of species, the infestation and destruction of forests, the cruelty of a prolonged drought that has forced herders and growers into a nightmarish conflict over a shrinking patch of viable land in Darfur. In the coming years, changes in the climate will bring with them immense losses, and I think they will test our spirits in ways they have never been tested before. But these same changes in the natural world will also give us a unique opportunity for a huge growth spurt in our social evolution. As nature washes away part of our history, it will also create a new space in which we can begin to restructure ourselves in ways that are simultaneously local and global, that are enduringly sustainable, and most emphatically, fundamentally equitable. In other words, nature will be exacting a terrible price in exchange for giving us one more chance to try one more time to finally get it right. And one indispensable element of getting it right requires a press that tells us the truth. And the truth is that we are now crossing a threshold into an era of runaway climate change. The transition will be hard. There is no body of expertise, no authoritative answers for this one. We are crossing into uncharted territory. Since there is no precedent to guide us, we are left with only our own hearts to consult, the intellectual integrity to look reality in the eye, whatever courage we can muster, and our uncompromising dedication to a human future that reflects the combined aspirations of every single person in this room. So thank you all so much for your attention.
I'm going to make Ross answer questions in just a minute. Before I do, three things I want to say. One is, if you enjoy this kind of thing, every Thursday at 12:15 for you freshmen, the Environmental Studies Colloquium meets in this room beginning, Diane? Beginning tomorrow, 12:15 with lunch. It's probably the single most, for my money, the most stimulating intellectual, regularly occurring intellectual exercise here on the campus, and I think you'll enjoy it enormously. Second, events like this don't happen on their own. Janet Wiseman and especially Chris Shaw, the executive director of this fellowship program, made this thing really happen today, and we're enormously grateful to them both, and especially to Chris. So thank you very much. final thing, just in case we're mildly bummed out by what Ross had to say, I'm just going to add one tiny news update from today, okay? Just as I was coming in, I noticed on my computer a news flash coming in, and so I peeked at it while Ross was talking. And it concerns a neighbor of ours, Federal Judge William Sessions, an Addison County neighbor of ours, who earlier today in a landmark ruling overturned the objections of the Detroit to the new California auto emissions, which will now be in effect in California, in Vermont, and in a lot of other places. So a big step and a good thing. How about Ross will answer questions if that's...
I'd be happy to. Stay with me because my hearing is bad.
Okay,
So
okay. Ross, I was going to say, Ross will answer questions, and then there's books outside, cookies outside, other stuff outside when we're done. But Ross, if you don't, I'll just sort of hang around here, and if you don't hear,
okay,
I'll fire away, folks.
Tomatoes, eggs.
Rich.
I'm not at all bummed out what you said. You presented a vision of, I think, a reasonably achievable future that will get us out of the problems we're facing. I have a very minor nitpicking question, maybe for both of you, about a matter of terminology. You use the term clean energy many times, and the press uses a lot. And I wonder if that's a confusing term. And I wonder if it's a confusing term because people think of horrible toxins belching out of smokestacks, and they said, oh, if only we could, stop doing that, we'd be okay. But that isn't what the climate thing is about, and that isn't what greenhouse emissions are about. They aren't about dirty energy. In fact, they're about energy that we make as clean as possible as long as we're going to combust fossil fuels, and we get rid of all those bad toxins and the mercury and the salt and everything else, and we make nice pure carbon dioxide, which is just what we want to make when we burn these fuels. So I wonder if that term confuses the public and makes them think this problem is just like all the others that we sort of solved, the acid rain problem, the ozone problem, and it is much deeper.
It's a good question. It's shorthand for non-carbon energy, basically. And that probably is a better phrase to use. So on the other hand, you're the first person who's raised that, so I'm not sure how confusing it is. But absolutely, we should be more explicit about non-carbon-based forms of energy.
There you go.
We're talking about energy production here. There are other sources of greenhouse gases. One of the major ones, I think, is the meat industry. And I understand that outstrips the production of CO2 by automotive industry, transportation industry. I was wondering if you bring that into the picture.
It is, but I think we really have to first focus on our fuels that we use, and I think naturally that releases from the meat industry would sort of follow and come down. I think it's not so much carbon dioxide as methane from meat. And methane, as you know, is a very powerful heat-trapping gas. It's different from carbon dioxide in that it only stays up there for a matter of months or a year or two, and then it settles out. But I have a problem sort of stepping beyond the boundaries of climate change into what might be construed as a moralistic approach to other people's lifestyles. And so for that reason, I am reticent to tell people not to eat meat. It turns out that at home we eat about 98% vegetarian. That's our choice. I really am not comfortable sort of making pronouncements about other people's lifestyles. And I do think that if our fuels were changed, there would then be pressure and spotlight focused on the meat industry, and that also would begin to reduce its emissions.
David?
Seems to be a trend going on over here. You mentioned at the very beginning that the U.S. press has largely ignored the global climate change crisis, but not so in some countries of Europe. Now, they have a commercial news media, and they have oil and gas companies. What's the difference in the news media that might explain that response?
It's a really good question, and I'm not sure what the difference is, but absolutely. I mean, I also get the Financial Times, and there's stories about climate change 3 times a week in the Financial Times, and probably 2/3 of the items I put on my website are from foreign English language, but foreign newspapers. It seems to me that the auto and oil industries have primarily focused their attention and threatened to withdraw advertising and so forth really more on the American press than elsewhere. And also, the American public is not as generally aware of this issue as they are in Europe. So for that reason, it's also the bottom line truth, and I'm sure this calculation goes on in the minds of the people who run the oil industry, that if the U.S. is not with the program, the rest of the world just isn't going to do that much. I mean, Holland and Britain and President Chirac and Germany, they've all pledged these large cuts. But if the U.S. isn't with them, they're not going to be able to really make them. Because if they do, they're going to end up putting their countries, if they do it unilaterally, they're going to put their countries at a very big competitive disadvantage, and they can't do that. So there are a lot of articles in the British press complaining that the government's not living up to Tony Blair's commitment of 60% reductions, I think, by 2050 or something like that. But in fact, they can't without putting themselves at a competitive disadvantage. And I'm sure that's the calculation of the oil industry and the coal industry, and that's why they're really focusing more on the U.S. than on the European media. That's my speculation. Sure.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought you said climate change is no longer a scientific issue, but an ideological issue. And if that's true, if it's more about different opinions about who's to blame, if someone's to blame, how to approach this, how to divvy up costs, then is balance, as a journalist and not as an activist, if there's some difference, is balance necessary? Is a voice of between those who aren't necessarily skeptics but don't share the same values, is that necessary in journalism, in this type of reporting?
Yeah, I think it is, because it would then, if it were generally accepted, if the science were accepted and the reality were accepted, and then you had people on different sides of the issue arguing to go in different ways or let it go on for a while and then deal with it later when we have more money to deal with it, then balance is necessary, because then what you're doing is reporting on a policy debate. And in that point, in that area, it's not a question of fact. It's a question of whose opinion, several different opinions based on a universally accepted reality. And in that case, I think balance would be required, for sure. I do.
I read an account recently which said that due to the German subsidies, Germany's actually caused a shortage of some of the inputs that you need to build solar panels. And I was wondering whether you think that these technologies and others will be able to meet the energy demand we have right now and meet the demand of the future, which will probably have to accommodate another 3 or so billion people.
It's a really good question. First of all, let me start by saying there are a couple of studies from the Department of Energy that say that if we were, this is just in the U.S., if we were to build big wind farms in the nation's wind corridors, these are in the upper Midwest, the Dakotas, West Texas, or maybe some onshore and offshore, those wind farms could produce all the electricity the country uses today. So there's no question about that. In terms of your question about, and that's also applicable in other countries, given this array of non-carbon energy sources that we now know about, and hopefully eventually hydrogen will come online. But my real hope is this, that because of global warming becoming a reality, people will realize we are living on a planet with limits and we are bumping up against those limits. And that, to me, will trigger a change in values that might start with an energy transition, but that will lead to things like closed-loop industrial systems, to smart growth planning, to a lot more recycling, to the adoption of environmental accounting in the way we calculate our wealth and poverty, and to a whole new ethic of sustainability that would basically transform our dynamics and practices in ways we can't begin to imagine. And I think that would happen in pretty short order after, if someone suggested it became accepted reality that that we're polluting the atmosphere to such an extent that we're really destabilizing the planet. That's my hope of what would happen. That's my optimistic scenario for it. If you ask me whether I think it will happen, probably not, but that's my sort of optimistic hope that it could happen that way.
I read Boiling Point recently, and in
Thank
your
you.
last chapter in your proposed solution, you made one point that I thought was a really good point. I'm just wondering, I checked in the back and I didn't find any sources on that. I'm wondering how you came to that conclusion. The point is that if you stop buying oil from the Mideast, the political and economic repercussions will cause more antagonism to the states and more problems eventually. I'm wondering how you came to that conclusion.
It's a very good question, because any global solution has to include the oil-producing countries of the Middle East. And it so happens that a few years ago I was in Cairo. I was invited to a UN thing in Cairo, and I was invited for one afternoon to give a briefing to the executives of Shell Egypt, which is the Egyptian oil company. And I gave them my rap on the climate, and they said, "That's great, what's in it for us?" And I said, hydrogen is going to be the central fuel of a new energy economy. And if you were to cover your deserts with saltwater pipelines and windmills and photovoltaic panels, because you make hydrogen by the cleanest way to make hydrogen is by putting electricity into water, you could be an energy supplier, a hydrogen supplier to Europe and to West Asia and North Africa, and you could still maintain your geopolitical role by using the resources on top of your deserts instead of the resources underneath them. And so that's basically what I was thinking of when I wrote that line, and I'm sorry I didn't spell it out more completely in Boiling Point.
Back here.
One of the things which I thought was really inspiring about your talk was that you presented a solution, which is something that you don't often hear or see journalists doing. And so I know that journalists, as you talked about, didn't do a great job in terms of presenting an awareness and cultivating an awareness. What do you think is the journalist's role in terms of presenting a solution? Have they done a good job? Is it possible for journalists to move into that niche and get people thinking of where we can go and having hope?
I think that is a really good question. And there's certainly a lot of other big-scale solutions out there besides mine. And what I'd love to see is the journalists accepting the fact that climate change is happening, accepting the fact that you have Jim Hansen, you have Rajendra Pachauri, who's head of the IPCC, you have Sir James Lovelock, you have all these really major people saying we are either at or very close to a point of no return. We need large-scale global solutions, and let's look at all the different ones that are being put forward and make that the focus of a lot of articles, and not just op-ed pieces and editorials, but really comparing different plans, seeing how they work, seeing what the flaws are, seeing what the objections are. But before that becomes an important story to the press, there has to first be a recognition that this stuff is happening really fast and big. And then that would be a natural follow-on. Right now, for example, the press reports on a lot of people's proposed solutions to the Iraq War. They report on Biden's suggestion that we break it up into three separate ethnic groups with an administrative center and other people who are saying other ways of solving the problem. They reported on the Baker-Hamilton Commission that we bring in Syria and Iran. So in the same way, I would love to see the press begin to cover and pit one against the other, or at least explore the benefits and the flaws of big kind of solutions. But until they acknowledge this problem is out there, that's not going to happen. With the Iraq War, unfortunately, they have to at least acknowledge it is happening. So.
Just very briefly, you mentioned biofuels as a possible solution and a list of other solutions, and I think one should be extremely careful of that, given our discussions of the last few days.
Right.
I think if it's any kind of solution at all, it's an extremely small one and should be approached with enormous suspicion, let's put it that way. Second brief point is that you seem to, at some point in your speech, portray the U.S. as being kind of out of step with the rest of the world, particularly Europe, in terms of awareness. But I don't think people in the States always realize quite what an impact these Exxon-funded denialists have had in other parts of the world. Certainly there's evidence that they've had an impact in India, and I know from my own reporting in South Africa, there are some very influential Exxon-funded denialists in South Africa that are attempting to make Africa step out of Kyoto or post-Kyoto type of treaties as well. So just to say that the effect of this work is far, far larger. I mean, it's a point that you made, but look at it in a slightly different way, that these Exxon guys are not only active here.
Okay, good. In terms of biofuels, you're absolutely right, and it's only recently that I'm becoming aware of a lot of reservations about biofuels, and so they should be put in parentheses, if at all, in this little litany of solutions technologies. But as to your second point, I don't think that the denialists have had the same kind of hold in other countries as they have, particularly in the U.S. and Australia, Australia being the world's biggest coal exporter. And my backup for that is the fact that you've had, oh, there's a denialist in Middlebury College. My backup for that is the fact that you had such agreement on 80% by Holland and 60% by Britain and 50% by Germany, and Chirac called it for 75% for the whole industrial world. So from my point of view, the denialists really haven't gotten anywhere near the leverage over primary central public policy in other countries that they have in the U.S.
A couple more. Yes.
Hi, Ron. Thanks so much for staying with this topic for so long, I mean, years, and you're really one of the leaders.
Well, I'm following Bill's footsteps. Bill won't let me quit.
Both of you, big time. I was wondering, you never mentioned nuclear. And I'm wondering if that is one of the ways that we're going to pull our butts out of the fire. Because just what you see happening around the world is everybody, the number of plants are
Right.
huge in the United
Right.
States and the rest of the world.
It's interesting. James Lovelock is promoting nuclear, and he's saying we're already past the point of no return. To me, without getting into specific details of nuclear stuff, I think there are two large-scale objections. The first is, if you're going to have a viable nuclear network, you need a reliable and stable environment. And we don't have that anymore. So, for example, in the UK, they have sited a lot of their nuclear plants along the coastline, and as we're seeing rising sea levels and stronger storm surges, they're having to shut down nuclear plants and so forth, and that's a real issue. In the U.S., I think the reason that there's been a lag on nuclear is really for security reasons. They're afraid of terrorists getting hold of spent fuel and using it, so that's a second concern. But the basic concern is this. How many windmills could you build for the cost of one nuclear plant? Okay? And that's just in terms of construction. And in terms of ongoing operational costs, for windmills, it's virtually nothing. You repair a broken blade. It's not a big deal. So from a cost point of view and from an environmental stability point of view, I don't think it's a very wise choice. I really don't. And the final point is, and I sort of teased it toward the end of my talk, a nuclear system depends on a centralized energy system. And I think the way toward the future is to a decentralized energy system, where you have solar where there's sunlight, and you have wave and tidal power where you're in the coastlines, and you have hydropower, small-scale hydro where that's appropriate, and you have a real decentralized mix so that our energy system sort of mimics an ecosystem, whereby you have a lot of redundance. If one goes down, you have others to pick it up, and it makes us much less vulnerable to both natural disasters and to belligerence and antagonism and terrorism and so forth, if you have a decentralized rather than a centralized energy system, and nuclear requires a centralized system.
Two-part question. I'm told this week that the price of wheat has begun to escalate because so much has been turned to corn this summer. I mean, it's true right around here.
Right.
Fields that we haven't used in corn are now in corn.
Yeah.
My question is, first of all, is that true that the wheat price has gone up? I just
You mean the corn price?
and the price of bread.
Oh, the wheat price?
Gone up. Okay.
Okay.
If so, how much of this so-called excess corn is going to make it to gas and oil
I am very opposed to the use of corn for biofuels because we have a hungry world out there. And I think we should not be using corn for a number of reasons. The first and foremost one is humanitarian and the need for food. The second is that corn is one of the least efficient sources of biofuels. It produces fractionally more energy than it takes to create it. And if there's a future for biofuels at all, and I'm not sure there is, I think it should be coming from prairie grasses and sawgrasses and so forth, certainly not from corn. As to why wheat prices are up, I just don't know. I don't have a clue. Oh, I see. Oh, it's because the wheat's being replaced by corn in anticipation of this boom. Okay, I see. Yeah. Anyway, that's my response.
Thank you, Ross. We have refreshments in the hallway, books to buy and have signed, which I'm sure Ross will be happy to sign. And you can hang around and talk to him for another half an hour or a little bit more. So thank you.
Thank you all very, very much. Thank you. You are a great audience to talk to, and you have really intelligent questions, and I really appreciate it. So thank you very much.